It was the autumn of 1975 in Pine Ridge, Arkansas, a town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were as rare as strangers. The leaves had turned their familiar shades of amber and rust, carpeting the narrow streets that connected modest homes with white picket fences and wraparound porches. Television antennas stretched toward the sky like metal prayers, pulling in signals from Little Rock when the weather cooperated. Rebecca Lane was 23 years old that October, a young woman whose laugh could be heard 3 houses down, and whose determination had carried her through 2 years at the local community college. She worked mornings at Henderson's General Store, where the wooden floors creaked under every footstep, and the smell of penny candy mixed with motor oil created the distinctive aroma that defined small-town commerce in the mid. Rebecca lived in a small apartment above Murphy's Diner on Main Street, a space she'd decorated with macrame wall hangings and earth-tone furniture that reflected the era's aesthetic. Her neighbors knew her routine by heart. Coffee at 6 a.m., work by 7, lunch break at noon, spent reading romance novels on the bench outside the post office, and evenings dedicated to her correspondence courses in accounting. She drove a powder blue 1972 Ford Pinto that her father had helped her buy with money saved from countless shifts at the general store. The car was her pride and independence, a symbol of the modern woman she aspired to become in a world that was slowly changing around the traditional rhythms of Pine Ridge. On Tuesday, October 14, 1975, Rebecca followed her usual morning routine. Emma's Dorothy Crane, who lived in the apartment next door, heard Rebecca's alarm clock at 5:45 a.m., followed by the familiar sounds of coffee brewing and the local radio station playing Carole King's So Far Away. Dorothy would later tell investigators that everything seemed perfectly normal that morning. The same sounds she'd heard hundreds of times before. At Henderson's General Store, Rebecca unlocked the front door at exactly 7 a.m., just as she had every workday for the past 18 months. Harold Henderson, the store's owner, was running late that morning due to a doctor's appointment in the county seat. He arrived at 8:30 to find Rebecca efficiently handling the morning customers, farmers picking up supplies, housewives gathering groceries, and children buying penny candy before school. She was in good spirits, Harold would recall years later, his weathered hands gesturing as he spoke, humming some tune while she restocked the cigarette display. Asked me about the new shipment of winter coats we were expecting. Nothing unusual at all. Rebecca's lunch break that Tuesday was observed by several townspeople. She sat on her usual bench outside the post office, reading a paperback copy of Jonathan Livingston Seagull, while eating a sandwich she'd brought from home. Postmaster Eugene Walsh noted that she seemed relaxed, occasionally looking up to wave at passing neighbors. The afternoon proceeded without incident. Rebecca helped customers, organized inventory, and updated the store's handwritten ledger with the methodical precision that Harold Henderson had come to appreciate. As closing time approached, she counted the day's receipts and prepared the cash deposit for the First National Bank of Pine Ridge. At 5:30 p.m., Rebecca locked the store's front door and walked to her Ford Pinto, parked in its usual spot beside the building. 3 different witnesses saw her drive away. Thomas Mitchell, who was closing his barber shop across the street, Linda Saunders, who was walking her dog, and young Kevin Park, age 12, who was riding his bicycle home from baseball practice. All 3 witnesses would later provide consistent statements to the police. Rebecca had driven south on Main Street, toward the residential area where her apartment was located. Her car appeared to be functioning normally, and she had waved to Linda Saunders as she passed. But Rebecca Lane never made it home that evening. When she failed to appear for work on Wednesday morning, Harold Henderson initially assumed she was ill. Rebecca had never missed a day without calling, but Harold reasoned that she might have fallen sick overnight and couldn't get to a phone. Small-town Arkansas in 1975 operated on assumptions of eventual explanations. By noon on Wednesday, Harold's concern had deepened into worry. He walked to Murphy's Diner and climbed the external stairs to Rebecca's apartment. When his knocking received no response, diner owner Frank Murphy used his master key to open the door. Rebecca's apartment was exactly as she had left it the previous morning. Her bed was made with military precision. Tuesday's dinner dishes were washed and stacked in the drying rack. Her purse was gone, but her spare set of car keys hung on their usual hook by the refrigerator. The apartment felt suspended in time, waiting for someone who would never return. The Pine Ridge Police Department consisted of Chief Walter Goodman and 2 officers. Deputy Sam Morrison and Deputy Janet Phillips. Chief Goodman, a 47-year-old veteran who had served the community for over 2 decades, took the missing person report at 2 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon. At first, we figured she might have gone to visit family without telling anyone. Chief Goodman would explain in later interviews. Young people sometimes do impulsive things. We started with the assumption that she'd turn up in a day or two with a reasonable explanation. But by Thursday morning, that assumption began to crumble. Rebecca's parents, Donald and Martha Lane, lived 40 miles away, in Harrison. When Chief Goodman called them Thursday morning, they expressed immediate alarm. Rebecca called them every Sunday evening without fail, and she had spoken to them just 4 days earlier. She had mentioned no travel plans, no personal problems, no reasons to leave Pine Ridge suddenly. Rebecca was the most responsible girl you could imagine. Martha Lane would later tell reporters, her voice thick with emotion. She would never worry people like this. Something terrible must have happened. The search for Rebecca's Ford Pinto began on Thursday afternoon. Deputy Morrison and Deputy Phillips drove every road within a 20-mile radius of Pine Ridge, checking ditches, side roads, and abandoned property. They found nothing. Local volunteers joined the search on Friday. Men from the Baptist Church, the Volunteer Fire Department, and the American Legion organized systematic sweeps of the surrounding countryside. They walked through cornfields, searched abandoned barns, and checked every bridge and creek crossing in the area. The Ford Pinto had simply vanished, as completely as its driver. Chief Goodman contacted the Arkansas State Police on Friday evening, officially expanding the investigation beyond Pine Ridge's small department. Detective Sergeant Roy Blackwood arrived from Little Rock on Saturday morning, bringing with him resources and experience that the local police lacked. Detective Blackwood began by retracing Rebecca's final known movements. He interviewed the witnesses who had seen her leave work on Tuesday evening, examined her apartment for any signs of disturbance, and reviewed her personal relationships for potential explanations. Rebecca had no romantic entanglements that might have complicated her life. She had dated casually, but was not involved with anyone at the time of her disappearance. Her friendships in Pine Ridge were numerous, but superficial. The connections of a young woman who had grown up elsewhere and was still building deep roots in the community. Her financial situation was stable, if modest. The bank records showed regular deposits from her job at Henderson's General Store and careful spending, habits that reflected her practical nature. There were no large withdrawals, no suspicious transactions, no indicators of someone preparing to disappear voluntarily. As the weekend progressed, Detective Blackwood began to construct a timeline that raised more questions than answers. Rebecca had been seen driving south on Main Street at approximately 5:35 p.m. on Tuesday. Her apartment was less than half a mile from Henderson's General Store, a drive that should have taken no more than 3 minutes. Somewhere in those 3 minutes, between the General Store and her apartment, Rebecca Lane had vanished without a trace. The first week of the investigation yielded no significant leads. Roadblocks were established on highways leading away from Pine Ridge. Rebecca's description was broadcast on radio stations throughout Arkansas and the surrounding states. Her photograph appeared in newspapers from Memphis to Tulsa. But the powder blue Ford Pinto and its driver remained missing, as if they had been swallowed by the autumn evening itself. Detective Blackwood expanded his investigation to include the possibility that Rebecca had encountered someone she knew. Pine Ridge was the kind of community where people routinely offered rides to neighbors, helped stranded motorists, and trusted in the fundamental decency of their fellow citizens. She might have stopped to help someone, Detective Blackwood theorized during a meeting with Chief Goodman, or someone she recognized might have flagged her down. In a town this size, refusing to help a neighbor would be almost unthinkable. The detective interviewed every resident along Rebecca's route home, searching for anyone who might have seen her car after it left Main Street. But the residential streets of Pine Ridge were quiet that Tuesday evening, and a few people who had been outside were focused on their own evening routines. As October turned to November, the intensive search effort began to wind down. The volunteers returned to their regular lives. The state police resources were redirected to other cases, and Pine Ridge settled into an uncomfortable reality. Rebecca Lane was gone, and no one knew why or how. Chief Goodman continued to pursue leads as they trickled in. Reports of young women matching Rebecca's description came from truck stops and diners throughout the region, but each one proved to be a case of mistaken identity. Anonymous tips suggested everything from runaway theories to elaborate conspiracy scenarios, but none led to concrete evidence. Rebecca's parents made regular trips to Pine Ridge, posting flyers and pleading for information. They offered a reward for any information leading to their daughter's whereabouts, mortgaging their modest home to raise the money. But the reward generated only false leads and well-meaning but unhelpful speculation. As 1975 drew to a close, the case of Rebecca Lane's disappearance settled into the cold files of the Pine Ridge Police Department. Chief Goodman kept the investigation officially open, but the daily urgency had faded into the background rhythm of small-town law enforcement. The last documented sighting of Rebecca Lane remained that Tuesday evening in October, driving south on Main Street in her powder blue Ford Pinto, waving to a neighbor as she headed home from work. Everything about that moment seemed ordinary, unremarkable, safe. But somewhere in the gathering darkness of that autumn evening, Rebecca Lane had encountered something that would make her vanish from the world as completely as if she had never existed at all. The mystery would haunt Pine Ridge for decades to come, a wound that never quite healed, a question that never found its answer. Winter arrived early in Pine Ridge that year, blanketing the town in a silence that seemed to echo Rebecca Lane's absence. The snow muffled the sounds of daily life, creating an atmosphere where whispered conversations carried further than normal voices, and every creak of a settling house seemed amplified in the stillness. By December 1975, the investigation had taken on a different character. The urgent energy of the first weeks had given way to methodical routine, as Detective Blackwood and Chief Goodman worked through leads that grew increasingly tenuous with each passing day. The case files had expanded from a single manila folder to 3 thick binders, filled with witness statements, photographs, and reports that told the story of a search that had found everything except what it was looking for. Rebecca's parents, Donald and Martha Lane, had effectively moved to Pine Ridge. They rented a small room at the Pinnerview Motel on the outskirts of town, transforming it into an unofficial headquarters for their private search efforts. The motel room's wood-paneled walls were covered with maps, photographs, and handwritten timelines that Martha updated obsessively, searching for patterns that might reveal where their daughter had gone. Donald Lane, a quiet man who had worked 30 years at a paper mill in Harrison, channeled his grief into physical action. Every morning, he drove the back roads surrounding Pine Ridge, following routes that grew more remote with each passing day. He checked abandoned farmhouses, searched creek beds, and knocked on doors in settlements so small they didn't appear on most maps. He aged 10 years in those first few months. Harold Henderson would later recall, "You'd see him driving past the store every morning, always alone, always looking. It broke your heart to watch." Martha Lane's approach was different, but equally consuming. She spent her days talking to anyone who would listen, revisiting conversations with Rebecca's friends and co-workers, searching for details that might have been overlooked in the initial interview. Her notebook filled with fragments of information. Rebecca had mentioned wanting to take a photography class. She had been saving money for a new winter coat. She had talked about visiting her cousin in Texas sometime before Christmas. None of these details led anywhere concrete, but Martha collected them with the desperate hope that somewhere in the accumulation of small facts lay the key to understanding what had happened to her daughter. The community of Pine Ridge responded to the Lane family's presence with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. People wanted to help, but the continuing search served as a constant reminder that something dark had touched their safe, predictable world. Children were no longer allowed to walk home from school alone. Doors that had never been locked were suddenly secured each night. The easy trust that had defined small-town life began to erode under the weight of unanswered questions. Chief Goodman found himself dealing with reports that would have seemed absurd just months earlier. Residents called to report strangers walking through their neighborhoods, suspicious vehicles parked on side roads, and unexplained noises in the night. Most of these calls led nowhere, but Goodman investigated each one with the same thoroughness he brought to more credible leads. People were scared, Deputy Sam Morrison would explain years later. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew that if Rebecca could disappear, it could happen to any of us. That's a hard thing to live with, in a place where everybody knows everybody. As winter deepened, the search efforts faced increasing logistical challenges. Snow covered potential evidence, making outdoor searches nearly impossible. The bitter cold discouraged volunteers, and the shorter days limited the hours available for systematic searching. Detective Blackwood found himself spending more time reviewing existing evidence than gathering new information. The State Police Laboratory in Little Rock, had processed every piece of physical evidence collected from Rebecca's apartment and workplace. Fingerprints from her apartment belonged to Rebecca herself, her landlord, Frank Murphy, and a few friends who had visited recently. The cash register at Henderson's general store yielded dozens of fingerprints, but none that seemed relevant to the investigation. Rebecca's financial records revealed no surprises. Her bank account contained $1,247, a modest sum that reflected her careful spending habits. Her checking account showed regular deposits from her job and routine expenses: rent, groceries, gasoline, and small purchases at local businesses. There were no large withdrawals, no unusual transactions, no evidence of financial stress that might have motivated a voluntary disappearance. Detective Blackwood expanded his investigation beyond Pine Ridge, contacting police departments throughout Arkansas and the surrounding states. Missing person reports were cross-referenced, looking for patterns that might suggest a serial offender operating in the region. But Rebecca's disappearance seemed to exist in isolation, without connection to similar cases elsewhere. The detective also pursued the possibility that Rebecca had been the victim of a random crime. Highway robbery was not uncommon in rural Arkansas, and a young woman driving alone might have been seen as an easy target. But this theory faced a significant obstacle. Rebecca had disappeared on familiar streets in her own town, not on an isolated highway where such crimes typically occurred. Spring arrived in Pine Ridge, with an explosion of dogwood blossoms and redbud trees, but the beauty of the season felt muted by the continuing mystery. Donald and Martha Lane marked the 6-month anniversary of their daughter's disappearance by organizing a memorial service at Pine Ridge Baptist Church. The sanctuary was filled to capacity, with townspeople who had never spoken to Rebecca in life coming to honor her memory and support her grieving parents. Pastor William Clayton delivered a sermon about faith in the face of uncertainty, but his words seemed to echo hollowly in the large space. The questions that haunted Pine Ridge had no answers, and the passage of time had only made them more acute. After the memorial service, Martha Lane approached Detective Blackwood with a request that revealed the depth of her desperation. She wanted to hire a private investigator, someone who might bring a fresh perspective to the case. Detective Blackwood supported the idea, understanding that the state police resources allocated to the investigation would inevitably diminish as time passed and other cases demanded attention. The private investigator, James Carpenter, arrived in Pine Ridge in early May 1976. Carpenter was a former FBI agent who specialized in missing person cases, and his reputation for thoroughness had attracted clients from across the South. He established an office in a rented storefront on Main Street, just 3 blocks from where Rebecca had last been seen. Carpenter's approach differed significantly from the official investigation, where Detective Blackwood had focused on physical evidence and traditional investigative techniques. Carpenter emphasized psychological profiling and behavioral analysis. He spent weeks interviewing Rebecca's friends and co-workers, not looking for facts they might have forgotten, but trying to understand who Rebecca had been as a person. Most missing person investigations focus on the circumstances of the disappearance, Carpenter would later explain. But I've found that understanding the missing person's personality, motivations, and relationships often provides better insights into what might have happened to them. Carpenter's interviews revealed aspects of Rebecca's character that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Despite her outward confidence and independence, several friends described her as someone who struggled with loneliness. Rebecca had moved to Pine Ridge from a larger town, and while she had adapted well to small-town life, she had never fully integrated into the tight social networks that defined the community. She was friendly with everyone, but close to nobody, Carpenter noted in his case files. That kind of social isolation can make a person vulnerable in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The private investigator also discovered that Rebecca had been considering leaving Pine Ridge. She had inquired about transferring her college credits to universities in other states, and she had written to her cousin in Texas about the possibility of moving there after completing her accounting course. This information cast her disappearance in a different light, raising the possibility that she had planned to leave but had encountered something that prevented her departure. As summer arrived, Carpenter's investigation took an unexpected turn. While reviewing Rebecca's correspondence courses, he discovered that she had been in regular contact with other students throughout Arkansas and the surrounding states. These connections, maintained through mail and occasional phone call, represented a social network that existed completely outside Pine Ridge. One of these correspondences proved particularly intriguing. Rebecca had been exchanging letters with a man named David Mitchell, a fellow accounting student who lived in Fort Smith, about 60 miles south of Pine Ridge. Their letters, which Martha Lane had preserved in a shoebox, revealed a friendship that had been growing steadily more personal in the months before Rebecca's disappearance. David Mitchell became Carpenter's primary focus during the summer of 1976. The private investigator traveled to Fort Smith repeatedly, conducting extensive interviews with Mitchell and his associates, but Mitchell proved to have a solid alibi for the evening of Rebecca's disappearance. He had been attending classes at a local college, with dozens of witnesses who could confirm his presence. More troubling for the investigation was Carpenter's discovery that several of Rebecca's letters to Mitchell were missing. According to Martha Lane's careful records, Rebecca had written to Mitchell every 2 weeks throughout 1975, but the collection of saved letters contained gaps in September and October, just before her disappearance. When confronted about the missing letters, David Mitchell claimed he had thrown them away during a cleaning spree, but his explanation seemed inconsistent with his otherwise careful preservation of their correspondence. Carpenter suspected that the missing letters might have contained information relevant to Rebecca's disappearance, but without the letters themselves, he could only speculate about their contents. The summer of 1976 also brought changes to the official investigation. Detective Blackwood was promoted and transferred to a different division, and the Rebecca Lane case was assigned to Detective Patricia Wheeler, a younger officer who brought energy but less experience to the investigation. Detective Wheeler began by reviewing all existing evidence, looking for leads that might have been overlooked or inadequately pursued. Her fresh perspective yielded some insights, but no breakthroughs. The case had reached a frustrating plateau, where every lead seemed to circle back to the same unanswered questions. As autumn arrived, marking the first anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance, Pine Ridge found itself forever changed by the experience. The town had learned to live with uncertainty, but the cost of that adaptation was visible in small, persistent ways. The Thursday evening walks that had been popular among local women were no longer common. Parents drove their children to activities they had previously walked to alone. The easy familiarity that had once characterized interactions between neighbors had been replaced by a more cautious politeness. Donald and Martha Lane had exhausted their financial resources and were forced to return to Harrison, but they left behind a reward fund and a promise to return whenever new developments warranted their presence. The Pinnerview motel room they had occupied for nearly a year was finally cleaned and prepared for other guests, but the staff would always remember it as the Lane Room, forever associated with grief and searching. Chief Goodman continued to receive occasional tips and leads, but they arrived with decreasing frequency as public attention moved to other concerns. The case remained officially open, but it had become one of many files in the department's growing collection of unsolved mysteries. James Carpenter completed his investigation in December 1976, presenting a final report that contained more questions than answers. He had found no evidence of foul play, but also no evidence that Rebecca had left Pine Ridge voluntarily. His conclusion was unsatisfying but honest. Rebecca Lane had simply vanished, and the circumstances of her disappearance defied conventional explanation. "Someone in Pine Ridge knows what happened to Rebecca Lane," Carpenter wrote in his final report. But whether that person is unwilling or unable to come forward remains unclear. The truth exists somewhere in this community, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to bring it to light. As 1976 ended, Pine Ridge settled into an uncomfortable peace with a mystery that had consumed 2 years of community life. Rebecca Lane had become a ghost story, whispered about but rarely discussed openly. A reminder that even the safest places could harbor dangerous secrets. The powder blue Ford Pinto had never been found. Rebecca's apartment had been cleaned and rented to a new tenant. Her job at Henderson's general store had been filled by another young woman, who worked quietly and efficiently but never quite filled the space that Rebecca had occupied in the store's daily rhythm. But for those who had known Rebecca, who had searched for her, who had lived through the transformation of their community from a place of certainty to a place of questions, her absence remained a persistent presence. She existed in the negative space of Pine Ridge's consciousness, defined not by what was known about her disappearance, but by everything that remained unknown. Time moved forward, but the mystery remained frozen in October 1975, waiting for someone to speak the words that would finally explain what had happened to Rebecca Lane on that autumn evening when she had driven away from Henderson's general store and vanished into the gathering darkness. The silence that had settled over Pine Ridge was not empty, it was full of secrets, heavy with knowledge that someone, somewhere, carried, but had never shared. And in that silence, Rebecca Lane continued to exist, not as memory, but as possibility, as a question that demanded an answer, even as the years accumulated around it, like layers of dust on an abandoned road. 13 years had passed since Rebecca Lane's disappearance when the autumn of 1988 brought an unexpected revelation to Pine Ridge. The town had grown, modestly in the intervening years, a new subdivision on the eastern edge, a small shopping center where cornfields had once stood, and a generation of children who had grown up hearing Rebecca's name spoken only in whispers and half-remembered stories. Chief Walter Goodman had retired in 1983, replaced by his former deputy, Sam Morrison, who carried the Rebecca Lane case files to his new office like an inheritance he neither wanted nor could abandon. The manila folders had yellowed with age, their contents organized and reorganized by successive investigators who had each hoped to find the detail that would unlock the mystery. The discovery came from an unexpected source: the renovation of Pine Ridge's oldest house. The Blackwood mansion, no relation to the detective who had investigated Rebecca's case, sat on 3 acres at the southern end of Main Street, a Victorian-era showplace that had fallen into disrepair after the death of its last owner, Eleanor Blackwood, in 1986. The house had been purchased by developers from Little Rock, who planned to restore it as a bed and breakfast, capitalizing on Arkansas's growing tourism industry. The renovation team, led by contractor Russell Hayes, had been working on the property for 6 months when they made the discovery. The mansion's basement had been flooded repeatedly over the decades, and Hayes had decided to install a new drainage system that required extensive excavation around the foundation. It was Tuesday, October 18, 1988, almost exactly 13 years after Swin. Hayes's excavator struck something metallic, buried 3 feet beneath the surface near the mansion's rear foundation. Initially, Hayes assumed they had hit an old septic tank or water line, but further digging revealed the unmistakable outline of an automobile. The car was lying on its side, in what appeared to be a natural depression that had been filled and graded years earlier. Decades of soil and debris had completely concealed its presence, and only the extensive excavation required for the drainage project had revealed its location. Hayes immediately stopped work and called the Pine Ridge Police Department. Chief Morrison arrived within minutes, followed by Detective Wheeler, who had remained assigned to the Rebecca Lane case despite the passage of years and the absence of new leads. Even before the car was fully excavated, certain details were unmistakably familiar. The size and shape matched a Ford Pinto, and traces of blue paint were visible beneath the rust and corrosion that covered most of the vehicle's exterior. But it was the Arkansas license plate, partially obscured by mud but still readable, that confirmed what everyone already suspected. This was Rebecca Lane's missing Ford Pinto. The excavation process took 3 days, conducted under the supervision of Arkansas State Police forensics experts who had been called in to assist with the recovery. The car had been severely damaged, whether by the impact that had deposited it in the depression, or by the years of moisture and soil pressure, was unclear, but enough remained intact to tell a story. Rebecca Lane's purse was found in the car, along with her keys, reading glasses, and the paperback copy of Jonathan Livingston Seagull she had been reading during her lunch breaks. The purse contained $23 in cash, credit cards, and her driver's license, nothing that suggested robbery as a motive for whatever had happened to her. But Rebecca herself was not in the car. The forensics examination revealed several troubling details. The car's steering column had been damaged in a way consistent with a high-speed impact, and there was evidence that the driver's side door had been forced open from the outside. Most significantly, the car's position in the buried depression suggested it had not simply rolled or crashed there, but had been deliberately concealed. Detective Wheeler coordinated with the state police to conduct a comprehensive search of the area surrounding the car's burial site. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan for other anomalies in the soil, and cadaver dogs were brought in to search for any trace of human remains. But despite extensive efforts, no other evidence was found. The discovery of the car answered some questions, but raised many others. How had Rebecca's Pinto ended up buried behind the Blackwood mansion? Why was Rebecca not with the car? And most puzzling of all, how had a vehicle been buried so thoroughly in such a visible location without anyone noticing. Detective Wheeler began by researching the ownership history of the Blackwood property. Eleanor Blackwood had lived alone in the mansion from 1960 until her death in 1986, maintaining the house and grounds with the help of occasional gardeners and handymen. The property's large size and Eleanor's reclusive nature had made it effectively invisible to most Pine Ridge residents. Despite its location on Main Street, the detectives' investigation revealed that Eleanor Blackwood had hired several different caretakers over the years, including some whose backgrounds were difficult to verify. In the 1970s, the mansion's grounds had been maintained by a series of transient workers who had often arrived in town without references and departed just as mysteriously. One name that appeared repeatedly in Eleanor's financial record was Thomas Garrett, a handyman who had worked on the property intermittently between 1974 and 1978. Garrett had lived in a small trailer on the mansion's grounds during the summers, helping with maintenance and yard work, in exchange for a modest salary and accommodation. Detective Wheeler's attempts to locate Thomas Garrett proved frustrating. The man had left Pine Ridge in 1978 and had apparently vanished as completely as Rebecca Lane herself. Social Security records showed no activity under his name after 1979, and despite extensive searches, no one seemed to know where he had gone or what had become of him. The timing of Garrett's presence on the Blackwood property was particularly troubling. He had been living on the grounds during October 1975, when Rebecca disappeared, and he had left Pine Ridge 3 years later, around the time that Eleanor Blackwood had hired a landscaping company to make extensive changes to the mansion's gardens and grounds. Detective Wheeler interviewed Eleanor Blackwood's niece, Patricia Blackwood Martinez, who had inherited the property and sold it to the developers. Patricia had visited her aunt occasionally over the years, but had never paid attention to the various workers who had helped maintain the mansion. Aunt Eleanor was very private about her business, Patricia explained during an interview at the Pine Ridge police station. She never discussed the people she hired, and I never asked. I assumed she knew what she was doing. The detective's investigation into Thomas Garrett revealed troubling gaps in his background. The Social Security number he had provided to Eleanor Blackwood belonged to a man who had died in 1972, 3 years before Garrett had arrived in Pine Ridge. His driver's license had been issued under false information, and the references he had provided when seeking employment could not be verified. Thomas Garrett appeared to be an identity assumed by someone who had deliberately obscured his true background. This discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case into something far more sinister. Detective Wheeler contacted the FBI, requesting assistance in identifying the man who had worked under the name Thomas Garrett. Federal agents arrived in Pine Ridge in November 1988, bringing with them resources for fingerprint analysis, facial reconstruction, and database searches that exceeded the capabilities of local law enforcement. The FBI's investigation proceeded methodically, but yielded few concrete results. No fingerprints had been preserved from Garrett's time in Pine Ridge, and the descriptions provided by Eleanor Blackwood's neighbors were too vague to support a reliable facial reconstruction. The man had been deliberately unremarkable, maintaining a low profile that had allowed him to work and live in Pine Ridge without attracting attention. As winter approached, the investigation faced the same challenges that had frustrated earlier efforts to solve Rebecca's disappearance. Despite the discovery of her car and the identification of a suspicious figure who had been present at the right time and place, the case remained maddeningly incomplete. The FBI agents returned to Little Rock in December, leaving behind a thick file of reports and recommendations, but no arrests or definitive conclusions. Thomas Garrett remained a phantom, possibly dead, possibly living under another assumed identity, possibly responsible for Rebecca's disappearance, but impossible to locate or prosecute. Chief Morrison found himself dealing with a community that had been unsettled by the discovery of Rebecca's car. The revelation that she might have been murdered, and that her killer had potentially lived among them for years, rekindled fears that had been dormant since the late 1970s. Parents who had relaxed their vigilance over the years once again began watching their children more carefully. The discovery also brought Donald and Martha Lane back to Pine Ridge for the first time in over a decade. Both had aged significantly in the intervening years. Donald's hair had gone completely white, and Martha walked with a cane butt. Their determination to find answers had not diminished. "At least we know she didn't leave voluntarily," Martha said during a press conference organized by Chief Morrison. "Someone took our daughter from us, and we won't rest until we know who and why." The press conference attracted media attention from throughout Arkansas and the surrounding states. Rebecca's story, which had faded from public consciousness over the years, was suddenly front-page news again. The discovery of her car, buried for 13 years in plain sight, captured the public imagination in ways that her original disappearance had not. But media attention did not translate into new leads. Despite extensive coverage and renewed public interest, no new witnesses came forward, and no additional evidence was discovered. The investigation had reached another plateau, more frustrating than the previous ones, because it seemed so close to a resolution that remained tantalizingly out of reach. As 1988 ended, Detective Wheeler compiled a comprehensive report that summarized everything known about Rebecca Lane's disappearance and the discovery of her car. The report painted a picture of a crime that had been carefully planned and expertly concealed, possibly by someone with experience in avoiding law enforcement detection. The detective's conclusions were supported by circumstantial evidence, but could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Rebecca had likely been abducted while driving home from work on October 14, 1975. Her car had been concealed on the Blackwood property by someone with access to the grounds and the equipment necessary for burial. The most likely suspect was the man known as Thomas Garrett, who had disappeared from Pine Ridge 3 years after Rebecca's vanishing. But without Thomas Garrett himself, or Rebecca's remains, or witnesses to the crime, the case remained officially unsolved. The discovery of the car had provided answers to some questions, while raising others that seemed even more difficult to resolve. Rebecca Lane was no longer simply missing. She was almost certainly dead, the victim of a crime that had been hidden beneath the surface of Pine Ridge for 13 years. But knowing what had probably happened was not the same as proving it, and proof remained as elusive as it had been on that October evening in 1975, when Rebecca had driven away from Henderson's General Store and vanished into the darkness. The powder blue Ford Pinto, rusted and damaged, but finally found, sat in the Pine Ridge police impound lot through the winter of 1980-89, a tangible piece of evidence in a case that remained frustratingly intangible. It was physical proof that Rebecca's disappearance had not been voluntary, but it could not speak the words that would identify her killer or reveal where her remains might rest. In the spring of 1989, the car was released to Donald and Martha Lane, who had it towed to a scrapyard in Harrison, where it was quietly dismantled and recycled. They kept nothing from it, except Rebecca's purse and the book she had been reading, small artifacts that somehow made her absence more real and more permanent than all the years of searching had accomplished. The discovery had brought closure of a sort, but not the kind that provided peace. Rebecca Lane was gone, and someone had taken her, and that someone had vanished as completely as Rebecca herself. The mystery had evolved, but had not been solved, leaving Pine Ridge to live with the knowledge that a killer had once walked among them, hidden in plain sight, protected by nothing more than a false name, and the assumption that evil things did not happen in places like Pine Ridge, Arkansas. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source in the summer of 1994, 19 years after Rebecca Lane's disappearance, and 6 years after the discovery of her buried car. It arrived not through police work or forensic analysis, but through the guilty conscience of a dying man and the moral courage of someone who had carried a terrible secret for nearly 2 decades. Dr. Michael Patterson had been the physician for most of Pine Ridge since 1968, a steady presence who had delivered babies, treated injuries, and provided comfort to the dying throughout the small community's most turbulent years. In June 1994, he was treating a patient named Carl Weber, a 67-year-old man dying of lung cancer, who had requested a private meeting away from his family. Carl Weber had moved to Pine Ridge in 1979, 4 years after Rebecca's disappearance, and had worked as a groundskeeper for the city's small park system until his retirement in 1991. He was known as a quiet, reliable man who kept to himself and never caused trouble. His request for a confidential meeting with Dr. Patterson seemed out of character, but terminal patients often needed to address unfinished business before death. What Carl Weber told Dr. Patterson during that June afternoon would eventually unravel the mystery that had haunted Pine Ridge for nearly 2 decades. Weber revealed that his real name was not Carl Weber, it was Thomas Garrett. He was the same man who had worked on the Blackwood property in the 1970s, the man who had vanished from Pine Ridge in 1978 and had become the primary suspect in Rebecca Lane's disappearance following the discovery of her car in 1988, Dr. Patterson listened in stunned silence, as Weber confessed to a crime that had consumed the community's attention for years. But the confession was not what anyone had expected. Thomas Garrett Carl Weber had not killed Rebecca Lane, but he had been present when she died, and he had helped conceal her death in a way that had turned an accident into what appeared to be murder. According to Weber's confession, the events of October 14, 1975, had begun with a mechanical failure that had nothing to do with criminal intent. Rebecca's Ford Pinto had experienced brake failure while she was driving south on Main Street, causing her to lose control of the vehicle as she approached the entrance to the Blackwood property. The car had crashed through the mansion's front gate and continued down the property's long driveway, finally coming to rest against a large oak tree near the rear of the house. The impact had been severe enough to kill Rebecca instantly, but the crash had occurred in a location that was not visible from the street or from neighboring property. Weber had been working in the mansion's garden when the accident occurred. He had rushed to the crashed car and found Rebecca's body, clearly deceased from injuries sustained in the impact. At that moment, Weber faced a decision that would define the rest of his life: destroy Rebecca's family's peace of mind for decades. Thomas Garrett was a man with a criminal past that he had been desperately trying to escape. He had served time in federal prison for armed robbery in the 1960s and had been living under an assumed identity since his release. The discovery of a dead woman on the property where he was working illegally using false identification and social security numbers would have meant an immediate return to prison and the end of the new life he had been trying to build. In a moment of panic and self-preservation, Weber had made the decision to conceal Rebecca's death rather than report it to authorities. He had moved her body from the car and buried it in a remote corner of the Blackwood property, then used the mansion's workshop tools to dismantle the Ford Pinto and bury it separately near the foundation. The entire concealment process had taken 3 days, during which Weber had worked at night to avoid detection. Eleanor Blackwood had been visiting relatives in Memphis that week, leaving Weber alone on the property, with time to complete his grisly task without interruption. Weber's confession explained many of the details that had puzzled investigators over the years. The damage to Rebecca's car had been caused by the crash, not by foul play. The evidence of the driver's door being forced open had resulted from Weber's efforts to remove Rebecca's body from the wreckage. The car's position in the buried depression had been the result of Weber's panicked efforts to conceal evidence, not a calculated attempt to hide a murder. But Weber's revelation also created new agonies for those who had spent years searching for Rebecca. Her death had been accidental, a tragic brake failure that could have happened to anyone, but the decision to conceal it had transformed a simple traffic fatality into a decades-long mystery that had consumed countless lives and resources. Dr. Patterson found himself in an unprecedented ethical situation. His patient had confessed to a serious crime, but Carl Weber was dying and would likely not survive long enough to face prosecution. More importantly, Weber's confession could finally provide closure to Rebecca's family and the Pine Ridge community, but revealing it would violate doctor-patient confidentiality. Weber solved Dr. Patterson's dilemma by requesting that the doctor contact the authorities after his death. He wanted his confession to be revealed, both to ease his own conscience and to provide answers to the questions that had haunted Pine Ridge for so long. Weber died on July 8, 1994, taking with him the personal anguish he had carried for 19 years, but leaving behind a detailed written confession that Dr. Patterson delivered to Chief Morrison the following day. The confession included specific details about the location of Rebecca's remains that only someone present at the time of concealment would have known. Weber had drawn a detailed map of the Blackwood property, marking the location where he had buried Rebecca's body under a grove of pine trees near the property's eastern boundary. Chief Morrison organized an immediate search of the area described in Weber's confession. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of an anomaly consistent with a buried body, and careful excavation revealed Rebecca Lane's remains exactly where Weber's map had indicated they would be found. Rebecca had been buried carefully, wrapped in a tarp that had partially preserved her clothing and personal effects. The coroner's examination confirmed that she had died from injuries consistent with a high-speed automobile accident, broken neck, and severe head trauma that would have caused instant death. There was no evidence of sexual assault or other violence that would have suggested criminal intent. The discovery of Rebecca's remains brought mixed emotions to her family and the Pine Ridge community. After 19 years of questions, they finally had answers, but the answers revealed that Rebecca's death had been preventable in ways that made it more tragic rather than less. Donald and Martha Lane, now in their 70s and frail from decades of grief and searching, faced the bitter knowledge that their daughter had died in a simple accident that had been transformed into a lifetime of anguish by one man's selfishness. Rebecca could have been buried with dignity and mourned properly if Thomas Garrett had simply called for help instead of protecting himself. She could have come home, Martha Lane said during a press conference announcing the resolution of the case. All these years, she could have come home if he had just done the right thing. The revelation of Weber's confession and the discovery of Rebecca's remains brought national media attention to Pine Ridge. The case became a cautionary tale about how fear and self-interest could transform tragedy into something far worse, and how the ripple effects of one person's bad decision could destroy multiple lives across multiple decades. But even with the mystery solved, questions remained about the broader implications of what had happened. How many other missing person cases might involve similar cover-ups? How many families were suffering needlessly because someone had chosen self-preservation over truth? Chief Morrison found himself fielding inquiries from law enforcement agencies across the country who wanted to review their own cold cases in light of the Pine Ridge revelation. The possibility that some missing persons might be accident victims whose deaths had been concealed rather than criminal victims opened new avenues of investigation in dozens of unsolved cases. The resolution of Rebecca's case also prompted changes in how Pine Ridge handled missing person investigations. The police department implemented new protocols for searching private property and expanded their cooperation with federal agencies in cases involving potential identity fraud. The lessons learned from 19 years of frustrated investigation would hopefully prevent similar tragedies in the future. Rebecca Lane was finally laid to rest in Harrison Cemetery on August 15, 1994, in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people who had never known her in life but had been touched by her story. Her gravestone bore a simple inscription: Rebecca Lane, 1952 to 1975. Finally home, the Blackwood Mansion renovation was completed in 1995, and the property opened as the Pine Ridge Bed and Breakfast. But it never quite escaped the shadow of the tragedy that had been hidden on its grounds for so many years. Guests occasionally asked about the Rebecca Lane room, though no such designation existed, and local ghost stories inevitably incorporated elements of her story. Thomas Garrett's grave in the Pine Ridge Cemetery remained unmarked, his real identity known, but his legacy defined entirely by the moment of cowardice that had caused so much suffering. Some residents felt that he deserved forgiveness for finally revealing the truth, even if it had taken 19 years and his impending death to motivate the confession. Others believed that no amount of remorse could excuse the decades of anguish he had inflicted on Rebecca's family. Dr. Patterson retired from practice in 1995, citing the emotional toll of carrying Weber's secret and the weight of being the conduit through which the truth had finally emerged. He had done his duty as both a physician and a citizen, but the experience had left him profoundly changed by the recognition of how deeply one person's actions could affect an entire community. The Pine Ridge Police Department closed the Rebecca Lane case officially on September 1, 1994, filing a final report that documented the accident, the cover-up, and the eventual resolution. The case files, which had grown to fill 6 large binders over 19 years, were transferred to the Arkansas State Archives as a historical record of one community's long journey toward truth. For the residents of Pine Ridge, the resolution of Rebecca's case brought a complex mixture of relief and sadness. The questions that had haunted their community for 2 decades had finally been answered, but the answers revealed that much of their suffering had been unnecessary. Rebecca Lane had not been the victim of a predatory stranger or a random act of violence. She had died in the kind of accident that could happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. The true tragedy lay not in her death, but in how her death had been handled by someone more concerned with protecting himself than with doing what was right. Thomas Garrett's decision to conceal Rebecca's accident had stolen 19 years of peace from her family, and had turned a community's natural sympathy into decades of fear and suspicion. In the end, Rebecca Lane's story became a reminder that truth, however painful, is preferable to uncertainty, and that the courage to do the right thing in moments of crisis can spare countless others from years of suffering. Her death had been quick and painless, but the aftermath had caused anguish that lasted nearly 2 decades, simply because one person had chosen fear over honesty. The mystery that had defined Pine Ridge for so long was finally solved, but its resolution served as a sobering reminder that the most destructive secrets are often the ones we keep to protect ourselves, regardless of the cost to others. Rebecca Lane had been gone for 19 years before she could finally come home, and the delay had been caused not by the circumstances of her death, but by the choices made by someone who valued his own freedom more than her family's peace of mind. 30 years have passed since Rebecca Lane's body was finally laid to rest in Harrison Cemetery, and Pine Ridge has evolved into a community that bears little resemblance to the small town where she once worked at Henderson's General Store. The main street that Rebecca traveled on her final evening has been widened and modernized, lined with chain restaurants and big-box stores that serve a population that has tripled since 1975. But memory has a way of persisting, even as landscapes change, and Rebecca's story continues to resonate through the community in ways both obvious and subtle. The Pine Ridge Police Department, now housed in a modern facility that replaced the small building where Chief Goodman once kept her case files, maintains a memorial wall for unsolved cases. Rebecca's photograph holds a place of honor there, not because her case remains unsolved, but because it serves as a reminder of the cost of leaving questions unanswered. Detective Patricia Wheeler, who spent the better part of 2 decades working Rebecca's case, retired in 2010, but still lives in Pine Ridge. Now in her 70s, she has become something of an unofficial historian for the case, speaking occasionally to journalism students and law enforcement trainees about the challenges of investigating disappearances in an era before cell phones, DNA analysis, and computerized databases. People ask me if I'm satisfied with how the case ended. Detective Wheeler explains during a recent interview in her modest home on Elm Street. The truth is, there's no real satisfaction in a case like Rebecca's. We found answers, but they came too late to prevent decades of suffering. That's the real tragedy, not that she died, but that she couldn't come home when she should have. The Rebecca Lane case has become a study subject in criminal justice programs throughout Arkansas and neighboring states. Professor Linda Martinez at the University of Arkansas uses it to teach students about the evolution of missing person investigations and the importance of psychological factors in witness behavior. The case illustrates how fear, shame, and self-preservation can transform minor crimes into major tragedy, and how the passage of time can make resolution more difficult rather than easy. Rebecca's story is really 2 stories. Professor Martinez explains to her students. There's the story of what actually happened. A young woman died in a car accident. There's the story of what people believed happened. A young woman was abducted and murdered. The difference between those 2 stories caused immeasurable pain to everyone involved. Donald Lane passed away in 2003, 8 years after his daughter's remains were found, having lived long enough to see her properly buried, but not long enough to find peace with the knowledge of how unnecessary their decades of searching had been. Martha Lane survived until 2015, reaching the age of 87, while carrying the complex emotions of a mother who had finally learned her daughter's fate, but could never quite forgive the man who had kept that fate hidden for so long. Martha's final interview, conducted just months before her death, revealed the lasting impact of Rebecca's case on those who loved her most. I used to think the not knowing was the worst part, she said, her voice still carrying traces of the Arkansas accent that had never left her despite decades of traveling to search for her daughter. But knowing what really happened, and knowing it didn't have to be a mystery at all, that might be even harder to live with. The Blackwood Mansion, now operating successfully as the Pine Ridge Bed and Breakfast, has found ways to acknowledge its connection to Rebecca's story, without exploiting the tragedy for commercial gain. A small memorial garden near the location where her car was found features a stone bench with a plaque that reads simply, "In memory of Rebecca Lane and all those who wait for answers." The inn's owners donate a portion of their profits each year to organizations that assist families of missing persons. Dr. Michael Patterson's decision to reveal Thomas Garrett's confession after his patient's death established a precedent that has influenced medical ethics discussions nationwide. The case is now cited in medical school curricula as an example of how physicians must balance patient confidentiality with broader social responsibility. Dr. Patterson's choice to honor his dying patients wished to reveal the truth while respecting the confidential nature of their relationship has been generally praised by ethicists as a model for handling similar situations. The impact of Rebecca's case extended far beyond Pine Ridge's boundaries. The revelation that a missing person case could involve an accidental death concealed by fear rather than criminal intent prompted law enforcement agencies across the country to re-examine their own cold cases. Several previously unsolved disappearances were eventually resolved when witnesses came forward with information they had previously withheld out of fear or shame. Most notably, the 1981 disappearance of college student Jennifer Walsh in Tennessee was solved in 1996 when a construction worker confessed to accidentally striking her with his truck and burying her body rather than reporting the accident. The worker cited the publicity surrounding Rebecca Lane's case as his motivation for finally revealing the truth after 15 years of secrecy. Similar resolutions occurred in Oklahoma, Missouri, and Louisiana, suggesting that Rebecca's story had touched a nerve among people who had been carrying similar secrets. The psychological impact of knowing that others had eventually found the courage to tell the truth seemed to make confession easier for those who had been living with hidden guilt. Chief Sam Morrison, who guided the Pine Ridge Police Department through the most challenging period of the Rebecca Lane investigation, retired in 2005 but continues to speak at law enforcement conferences about the lessons learned from the case. His presentations focus on the importance of maintaining open minds during missing person investigations and the need to consider psychological factors that might motivate witnesses to withhold information. "We always assumed that if someone knew what happened to Rebecca, they would tell us," Chief Morrison explains during these presentations. "We never considered that someone might know what happened but be too afraid or ashamed to come forward. That blind spot cost us years of investigation and caused immeasurable suffering to Rebecca's family." The Pine Ridge Police Department has implemented several policy changes based on lessons learned from Rebecca's case. Missing person investigations now routinely include psychological profiles of potential witnesses, and officers receive training in techniques for encouraging people to share information they might be reluctant to reveal. The department also maintains closer relationships with federal agencies that can assist in cases involving potential identity fraud or other complications that exceed local resources. The community's relationship with Rebecca's memory has evolved over the decades since her remains were found. Annual memorial services, which drew large crowds in the years immediately following the case's resolution, have given way to quieter forms of remembrance. A scholarship fund established in Rebecca's name provides financial assistance to young women pursuing accounting degrees, honoring her educational goals while helping others achieve the dreams that her death prevented her from pursuing. Henderson's General Store, where Rebecca spent her final day at work, closed in 1998 when Harold Henderson retired, and no buyer could be found for the aging building. The structure was eventually demolished to make way for a modern pharmacy, but a historical marker now stands near the location, commemorating both the store's role in Pine Ridge's commercial history and its connection to the town's most famous mystery. The marker's inscription reflects the complex legacy of Rebecca's story. On this site stood Henderson's General Store, where Rebecca Lane worked until her disappearance on October 14, 1975. Her story reminds us that truth, however delayed, ultimately serves the cause of justice and healing. Rebecca's case has also influenced how modern missing person investigations are conducted nationwide. The development of automated databases, improved communication between law enforcement agencies, and enhanced forensic capabilities have made it much more difficult for cases to remain unsolved for decades. But technology alone cannot address the human factors that complicated Rebecca's case: the fear, shame, and desperation that can motivate people to make choices that ultimately cause more harm than the original incidents they seek to conceal. Contemporary missing person investigators are trained to consider these psychological factors from the beginning of their cases, reaching out to potential witnesses with assurances of understanding and support, rather than assuming that anyone with relevant information will volunteer it freely. This approach has led to faster resolutions in many cases, and has prevented some tragedies from escalating into decades-long mysteries. The Rebecca Lane case has become part of Arkansas folklore, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the importance of honesty and the dangers of letting fear override moral obligation. Parents in Pine Ridge still tell their children about the young woman who disappeared, and the man who could have prevented years of suffering with a single phone call to the police. But the story's lessons extend beyond the specific circumstances of Rebecca's death and Thomas Garrett's cover-up. It serves as a reminder that communities are only as strong as their commitment to truth, and that individual choices, even those made in moments of panic or desperation, can have consequences that ripple through generations. For law enforcement professionals, Rebecca's case illustrates the importance of persistence, open-mindedness, and the willingness to challenge assumptions that might seem reasonable but prove to be incorrect. The investigation's eventual success came not from brilliant detective work or technological breakthroughs, but from the simple human act of a dying man choosing to tell the truth rather than take his secret to the grave. For families of missing persons, Rebecca's story offers both hope and caution. Hope that answers can emerge even after decades of uncertainty, but caution that those answers might be more painful than the questions they resolve. The Lane family's experience demonstrates that closure is not always the same as peace, and that learning the truth about a loved one's fate can create new forms of grief, even as it resolves old uncertainty. Today, Pine Ridge continues to grow and change, welcoming new residents who know Rebecca Lane's name only from historical accounts and memorial plaques. But for those who lived through the decades of searching, the case remains a defining experience that shaped their understanding of their community and themselves. The powder blue Ford Pinto that once carried Rebecca through the streets of Pine Ridge is long gone, scrapped and recycled into other objects that serve other purposes. The Blackwood mansion has been transformed from a decaying symbol of the past into a thriving business that serves visitors from around the world. The police station, the general store, and most of the other locations connected to Rebecca's story have been demolished or dramatically altered. But the questions that her case raised about truth, justice, and human nature remain as relevant today as they were in 1975. How do we balance individual self-preservation with collective responsibility? What do we owe to those who love and search for the missing? How do we find the courage to do the right thing when the stakes are high and the consequences uncertain? Rebecca Lane never had the opportunity to answer these questions for herself, but her story continues to pose them to everyone who learns about her life and death. In that sense, she remains a presence in Pine Ridge and beyond, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a reminder that our choices matter, that truth matters, and that the courage to speak honestly even when it's difficult or dangerous can spare others from suffering that might last for generations. The case files that once filled 6 thick binders in the Pine Ridge Police Department have been digitized and archived, preserving the documentation of a community's long journey toward understanding. But the real legacy of Rebecca Lane's story exists not in official records or historical accounts, but in the lives changed by her experience and the lessons learned from the tragedy that defined a town's understanding of itself. In the end, Rebecca Lane came home. It took 19 years longer than it should have, and the delay caused immeasurable pain to everyone who loved her. But she came home, and in coming home, she brought with her truths that continued to resonate decades after her death. Sometimes the most important lessons emerge from the darkest chapters of our shared experience, and sometimes the courage to tell the truth even when it comes too late to prevent suffering can still serve the cause of justice and healing. That, perhaps, is Rebecca Lane's most lasting legacy, the understanding that truth, however delayed, however painful, however incomplete, remains the foundation upon which communities build their capacity for justice, compassion, and hope.